Hello everyone, welcome to Horror Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos to relax, relieve stress, or even fall asleep. I think it would be great if you could leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from around the world. And if you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any other videos on the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I've worked in hospitals for most of my life. It's a job that changes you, makes you tougher, but also makes you aware of things that most people would rather ignore. It isn't just about the blood, the sickness, or the death. It's about the quiet moments, those strange silences that fill the hallways at night when the rest of the world is asleep. You see, hospitals are places of life and death, but they're also places of transition. That's what no one tells you, but everyone knows. There's something in the air, something that lingers, like a memory you can't quite place. I work the night shift, always have. I actually prefer it, even though everyone says it's the toughest shift. It's quieter, less chaotic, and there's a certain calmness that comes with it. But it's also when you start noticing things that don't quite add up. I remember the first time I experienced something I couldn't explain. It was a Thursday night, and the halls were particularly empty. The nurse's station was dimly lit, and the soft hum of the overhead lights filled the silence. I was sitting there doing some paperwork when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a scream, not a normal, confused patient kind of scream. It was different, like pure fear, like someone was calling for help from deep inside the building. It echoed through the halls, distant but unmistakable, and it seemed to come from below, from the basement. My stomach twisted, and I remember glancing around, expecting someone else to have heard it too. But there was no one, no other nurses, no doctors, just me. I grabbed the walkie-talkie from the desk, my fingers trembling slightly. I didn't want to go down there. I mean, who would? But I knew I had to check it out. What if it was a patient who had wandered down there and gotten hurt? I walked to the elevator, the walkie-talkie clutched tightly in my hand, my other hand hovering over the buttons. I hesitated before pressing the button for the basement. The doors closed with a soft ding, and I felt my stomach drop as the elevator descended. The air seemed colder as I went down, a chill settling in my bones that I couldn't shake. I tried to tell myself that it was just the old building, the drafts that always seemed to make certain places feel like a freezer, but it didn't help. When the doors slid open, the basement greeted me with complete darkness. I flicked on my flashlight, the one we all carried for these kinds of situations, and the beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the narrow hallway in front of me. The basement was mostly used for storage, old equipment, broken down gurneys, boxes of records that no one had looked at in years. It always had this smell, like old paper and dust, mixed with that chemical odor of hospital disinfectant. I stepped out of the elevator, the door closing behind me with a soft thud. The sound echoed through the dark, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The hallway stretched ahead, the walls lined with doors, some open, some closed. The air was heavy, and I could feel my heart pounding, each beat echoing in my ears. I moved slowly, my footsteps muffled by the cold tile floor, my flashlight beam sweeping from side to side. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small and fragile in the dark. There was no answer, just the soft hum of the building, the distant mechanical clunks of old machinery somewhere deep within the walls. I kept moving, passing by doors that led to supply rooms, old filing cabinets, and one that led to the furnace room. I reached the end of the hallway, and that's when I heard it again. The scream. It came from behind one of the closed doors, a door that led to a storage room we hardly ever used. The sound made my blood freeze. It wasn't just fear, it was terror, and it was coming from right there, just a few feet away from me. My hand was shaking as I reached for the door handle. My flashlight pointed straight ahead. I turned the knob slowly, the metal cold against my palm, and the door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo forever. The room was empty. I swept the flashlight across the space, the light catching on metal shelves filled with old medical supplies. Dust hung in the air, illuminated in the beam, and the only sound was my own breathing, short, shallow gasps that I couldn't control. I stepped inside, my shoes crunching against the gritty floor, the flashlight moving over every corner, every shadow. "Is anyone here?" I called out again, but my voice just bounced back at me, swallowed by the emptiness. I felt this overwhelming sense of wrongness, like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. I turned, ready to leave, when I heard it, a soft whisper, just behind me. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was there. My entire body went cold, and I spun around, my flashlight jerking to the side. There was nothing there. The room was empty. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. The whisper had been so close, like someone had been standing right behind me, breathing the words into my ear. I didn't wait any longer. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking so badly that the flashlight beam wobbled across the walls. I practically stumbled into the hallway, my heart racing, and made my way back to the elevator as fast as I could without breaking into a full-on sprint. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching endlessly, the shadows growing and shifting with every step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I was being followed, but there was nothing, just the empty hallway and the cold, stale air pressing in around me. The elevator doors finally opened, and I stepped inside, jabbing at the button for the main floor. The doors closed, and I let out a shaky breath, my head leaning back against the wall as I tried to steady myself. The ride up felt like it took forever, the elevator moving slowly, the lights flickering slightly as it ascended. I kept my eyes fixed on the doors, half expecting them to open and reveal something, someone, waiting there in the dark. When the doors finally opened, I almost stumbled out into the light of the main floor. The nurse's station was empty, the lights bright and almost blinding after the darkness of the basement. I walked over, setting my flashlight down on the counter, my hands still trembling. I tried to take deep breaths to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That sense that I had just narrowly avoided something I couldn't explain. The rest of the shift passed slowly, every minute dragging by, and I kept glancing towards the elevator, half expecting to hear the scream again. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the hospital at night, the distant sounds of machines beeping, the occasional shuffle of footsteps as one of the other nurses walked by. After that night, I tried to avoid the basement as much as possible. I'd make excuses, find reasons to send someone else if something needed to be checked down there. The other nurses didn't seem to notice, and I didn't tell them about what I'd heard. What could I say? That I'd heard screams in an empty room? That I'd felt something whispering in my ear when there was no one there? It sounded crazy, and I didn't want them to think I was losing it. But the basement wasn't done with me. A few weeks later, I was working another night shift, and the hospital was even quieter than usual. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavy, like something was waiting. I was at the nurse's station again, filling out charts, when I heard it, a noise that made my heart stop. It wasn't a scream this time, it was a laugh, soft, distant, echoing up from the elevator shaft. It sounded like a child, a high, breathy giggle that seemed to float up from the darkness below. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I turned to look at the elevator, my stomach clenching with fear. The doors were closed, but the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the basement. I stood up, my legs feeling weak, and I walked towards the elevator, my heart pounding in my chest. I pressed the button, and the doors slid open with a ding. The inside of the elevator brightly lit, empty. I stepped inside, my finger hovering over the button for the basement. I didn't want to do it. Every instinct was screaming at me to stay away, to leave it alone. But I pressed the button. The ride down was slow, the air growing colder with every floor, the hum of the elevator almost deafening in the silence. When the doors opened, the basement was dark again, the same heavy, oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the light. I stepped out, my flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky, echoing down the hallway. There was no answer, just the soft rustle of air, the distant clank of some forgotten piece of equipment echoing from deeper within the basement. My flashlight swept over the old doors, the shelves filled with supplies that no one had touched in years, and every step felt heavier than the last. as if the air itself was resisting my movement. My breathing felt shallow, each inhale sharp and cold. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That laugh, it hadn't been my imagination, I was sure of it. But as I made my way down the hallway, there was nothing but the emptiness, my own muffled footsteps, and the hum of the building. I reached the spot where the storage room door had been, the same door I had opened the first night I'd heard the scream. This time, the door was slightly ajar. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand, the beam wavering as I stared at the narrow crack of darkness. The air felt colder here, like the temperature had dropped by several degrees just in that spot. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and with my heart pounding in my ears, I pushed the door open wider. The flashlight's beam illuminated the room, the shelves casting long, skeletal shadows against the walls. I took a cautious step inside, my eyes scanning the darkness, and then I heard it, a soft rustling, like something moving just beyond the light. I turned the flashlight towards the far corner, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there. I stepped further into the room, and that's when I saw it. Something small, a piece of paper, lying on the ground just in front of one of the shelves. I knelt down, my fingers brushing against the cold floor as I picked it up. It was an old photograph, yellowed and creased like it had been there for years. I held it up to the light, squinting to make out the faded image. It was a picture of a child, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She was standing in front of a hospital bed, her eyes wide, a blank expression on her face. Something about her eyes made my stomach twist. They were too empty, too hollow, like she wasn't really there. There was no name, no date, nothing to tell me who she was or why the photograph was down here. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I quickly put the photograph back where I found it. That's when I heard the door creak shut behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat as the door slowly closed, the heavy thud echoing through the room. I rushed towards it, grabbing the handle, and twisted. It didn't move. The door was locked. Panic surged through me, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps as I pulled on the door, the metal cold beneath my fingers. I pounded on it, the sound muffled by the thick walls. The basement was supposed to be empty. There was no one else down here, no one who could have locked it. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room, the shadows growing darker, longer. The laughter came again. It was louder this time, echoing from just beyond the walls, a high-pitched giggle that made my skin crawl. I turned, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the empty shelves, the dust hanging in the air, the cold creeping in from every corner. The laughter seemed to circle the room, growing louder and then softer, as if it was moving, like whoever was laughing was running just out of sight. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking, echoing back at me from the walls. The laughter stopped, the silence pressing in around me, thick and heavy. I could hear my own heartbeat, the thud of it filling my ears. I took a step back, my back hitting the shelf, the metal rattling behind me. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it, a shadow. Small, low to the ground, like a child crouching. The beam of the flashlight wobbled as I pointed it towards the corner, my hands trembling, the light flickering slightly. The shadow moved, shifting away from the light, slipping back into the darkness. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my body frozen in place. I wanted to run, to scream for help, but I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. The air felt thicker now, like it was pressing in on me, the walls closing in, the darkness growing. And then the whisper came again, right in my ear. "Help me." It was so soft, so faint, but it was right there, just inches away from me. I turned, the flashlight swinging wildly, but there was nothing there. I stumbled forward, my fingers fumbling with the door handle, pulling and twisting, my entire body shaking. Finally, the handle gave way, the door creaking open, and I burst into the hallway, the air cold and sharp as I gasped for breath. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop to see if anything was following me. I just ran, the beam of the flashlight bouncing off the walls, the elevator seeming impossibly far away. I could hear the laughter again, echoing from behind me, growing louder, filling the hallway, and I pushed myself harder, my feet barely touching the ground. The elevator doors were open, and I practically threw myself inside, slamming my hand against the button for the main floor. The doors closed, and I felt tears streaming down my face, my entire body trembling as I leaned against the wall, the cold metal pressing into my back. The laughter faded as the elevator rose, replaced by the soft hum of the machinery, the lights flickering slightly above me. When the doors opened onto the main floor, I stepped out, my legs weak beneath me, my breathing still ragged. I walked to the nurse's station, my heart still pounding, and collapsed into the chair, my head in my hands. I tried to steady myself, to make sense of what had happened, but I couldn't. There was no explanation, no rational way to understand what I had seen, what I had heard. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I stayed at the station, refusing to go anywhere near the elevator, my eyes fixed on the clock, counting down the minutes until the morning staff would arrive. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? It sounded insane. Laughter in an empty basement, whispers in the dark, shadows that moved when they shouldn't. When my shift finally ended, I left the hospital without looking back, the early morning sun just starting to rise, the sky painted in soft pinks and oranges. I got into my car, my hands still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, and drove home, the events of the night replaying over and over in my mind. I never went back to the basement after that. I couldn't. Even the thought of it made my stomach twist with fear. I asked to be reassigned to a different part of the hospital, anywhere that wouldn't require me to go near those elevators, those halls that led to the darkness below. Sometimes, though, when I'm on the night shift, I still hear it. The laughter, faint, distant, echoing through the halls as if it's coming from somewhere deep within the building. And every time I feel that same cold fear, that same sense of something lurking just beyond the light, something that I can't see but can feel. And I know deep down that whatever is down there in the basement, it's still waiting, still watching, still calling for help. And that's the scariest part, knowing that it's real. Knowing that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that exist in the spaces we don't understand, things that are just waiting for us to notice them. And I did. I noticed, and I wish I hadn't. I took a job as a night security guard at a supermarket in Pennsylvania. I know what you're thinking. Why would anyone want to spend their nights in an empty supermarket, wandering between aisles of canned goods and produce under flickering fluorescent lights? To be honest, it seemed like easy money at first. I was between jobs, my savings were running out, and the manager offered a decent wage for something that seemed so simple. But things got strange almost immediately. On my first night, the manager, a gruff guy named Larry, handed me a list of rules. He was dead serious as he went over them, and I remember laughing at first, thinking it was some kind of initiation joke. But Larry didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He made sure I understood every rule before he handed me the keys and left. There were 10 rules in total, and they went something like this. Don't go into aisle 7. Don't even look down aisle 7. If you hear knocking from the freezer area, ignore it. Under no circumstances should you investigate. If you see a woman with long dark hair carrying a basket of raw meat, do not look directly at her. Never end your shift early. Always wait for the morning guard to arrive before you leave. If you find a shopping cart in the middle of the aisle, do not move it. Walk away and do not turn your back on it. You may hear the PA system crackle on and a voice call for assistance. Do not respond. Between 3 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., stay in the break room, lock the door, and do not look out until the time passes. If the automatic doors open on their own and no one comes in, stand still and do not make a sound until they close again. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. Keep walking until you reach a different aisle. Lastly, never ever fall asleep on duty. I remember Larry looking me dead in the eyes and saying, "These rules aren't a joke, kid. Follow them, and you'll be fine." He left, and I was alone, standing there with a list of rules that seemed like they belonged in a horror movie. The supermarket at night was nothing like during the day. The cheerful hum of people shopping, the chatter of kids begging for snacks, all of that was gone. Instead, there was this eerie silence, broken only by the buzz of the overhead lights and the occasional groan of the refrigeration units. The first hour or so was uneventful. I walked the aisles, doing my best not to think about the rules. But you know how it is. Tell someone not to think about something, and it's the only thing they can think about. I found myself glancing at aisle numbers, feeling my stomach drop every time I approached aisle 7. Even without looking down it, there was something wrong about it. It was like the air changed, became thicker, colder. I'd speed up my steps every time I passed by. Around midnight, I was doing a round when I heard it, the sound of a woman crying. The sound came from aisle 7. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The rules flashed in my mind. Do not go into aisle 7. Don't even look down aisle 7. I stood there, my hands getting clammy, trying to decide what to do. The crying grew louder, more desperate, and I had to clench my jaw to stop myself from turning my head. Suddenly, the crying stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, running footsteps. They were coming from aisle 7, running toward me. Panic shot through me and I bolted, my heart pounding in my chest as I ran down the nearest aisle. I didn't stop until I was in the back of the store, near the storage area. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my ears straining to hear anything else. But the store was silent again. I wanted to quit right then and there. But I needed the money, and there was a small part of me that was convinced it was just a prank. Maybe some elaborate trick the other employees played on new hires. I decided to stick it out, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. A couple of nights later, I was patrolling near the freezer section when I noticed something strange. There were handprints on the glass, long, thin handprints that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the surface. They weren't there before. The air around me felt colder, and I remembered the rule about the freezer. If you hear knocking, ignore it. I stared at the handprints, my breath fogging up the glass, and then I heard it. Soft, rhythmic knocking coming from inside the freezer. I backed away, my pulse racing. The knocking grew louder, almost frantic, and I forced myself to turn around, to walk away. As I did, I saw a shopping cart in the middle of the aisle, one that definitely hadn't been there a moment ago. I froze, the rule echoing in my head. Do not move it. Walk away, and do not turn your back on it. I took a deep breath and started to back away, keeping my eyes on the cart. It was then that I saw her. The woman with the long dark hair standing at the end of the aisle, a basket of raw meat hanging from her arm. She was facing away from me, but I could see her head slowly turning, her body twisting in a way that no human body should. I averted my eyes, remembering the rule. My hands were shaking, and I tried to steady my breathing as I sidestepped, keeping my gaze down, never looking directly at her. She moved closer, her footsteps light and almost gliding across the floor. I could hear the soft squelch of the raw meat shifting in the basket, and a chill ran down my spine. I had to get away, but she was blocking the path. I took a chance and darted down a different aisle, not daring to look back. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear. I stayed in the break room from 3 to 3:15, as instructed, locking the door and keeping my eyes fixed on the clock, my heart pounding with every tick of the second hand. The feeling of being watched never left me, and every small noise made me jump. By the time the morning guard arrived, I was a wreck. I handed over the keys, my hands trembling, and I left without a word. I didn't sleep that day. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, saw the way her body twisted, saw the dark hair hanging over her face. The next night, I almost didn't go back. But something compelled me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the stubborn part of me that refused to back down. I don't know, but I went back. Larry was there, waiting for me. He looked at me with this knowing expression, and he asked, "You follow the rules?" I nodded, and he clapped me on the shoulder. "Good. Just keep following them." That night, everything felt wrong from the start. The lights were dimmer, the air colder, the aisles seemed longer, stretching into shadows that shouldn't have been there. I was on edge, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I stayed, making my rounds, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to move at the edges of my vision. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I heard it. The PA system crackled to life, and a voice, distorted and low, called for assistance in aisle 7. My blood ran cold. Do not respond. I stayed where I was, my hands clenched into fists, trying to steady my breathing. The voice repeated, more insistent this time. Assistance needed in aisle 7. I closed my eyes, willing it to stop. Suddenly, the automatic doors at the front of the store slid open with a soft whoosh. I snapped my eyes open, my heart pounding. There was no one there, just the empty parking lot beyond. The doors stayed open, as if waiting for something. I stood still, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the doors slowly closed. The PA system went silent. I let out a shaky breath, my whole body trembling. I wanted to leave. I didn't care about the rules, didn't care about the job. I just wanted out. And then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Do not turn around. I started walking, my steps quick and unsteady, the footsteps following me, growing louder, closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, my vision narrowing as I focused on getting to the break room. I reached the door, my hands fumbling with the lock, and I slipped inside, slamming it shut behind me. The footsteps stopped. I locked the door, backing away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The clock on the wall read 3:01 a.m. I sank to the floor, my back against the door, and I waited. A week after I quit the job, I got a call from Larry. I had blocked his number, but he left a voicemail. I can still hear his voice, low and urgent. He said, "You have to come back. You have to finish your shift." Something in his tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Finish my shift? I never left early, and I always handed over to the morning guard. So what did he mean? Unable to sleep, I decided to drive over to the supermarket, just to see it, to reassure myself that I was done with that place. The parking lot was empty, the streetlights cast a dim glow, and the supermarket looked like a hollow shell in the darkness. I stood there, staring through the glass doors. The automatic doors opened quietly, as if they were inviting me in. My heart started pounding. Part of me was screaming to turn and leave, but my feet moved forward on their own. I stepped inside, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. That feeling returned, cold, bone-chilling fear. I carefully made my way through the aisles, trying to stay calm and reminding myself not to break any of the rules. But then I saw it, the entrance to aisle 7. The lights there were dimmer. The entire aisle seemed shrouded in an unnatural darkness. A faint sigh echoed from within, and I couldn't look away. My heart began to race, and I knew I should turn back. But something was calling to me, a whisper, a plea coming from deep within the shadows of aisle 7. Somehow, I found myself stepping closer, inch by inch. As I neared, I saw her, the woman with the basket of raw meat. She stood there, her head bowed, long hair covering her face. A voice echoed in my mind. "Finish your shift." I couldn't move. She slowly lifted her head, and I couldn't help but look. Her face, pale, her eyes hollow and empty. Suddenly, she lunged at me, moving fast like a shadow. I don't remember how I ran, only that I sprinted out of the supermarket, my feet barely touching the ground until I reached my car and drove away, not stopping until I was safely home. I never went back to that supermarket. I don't want to know what would happen if I finished my shift. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the cracks in my window, I still hear her voice, a whisper that lingers, as if she's waiting for me to return and finish what was left undone. And I know that no matter how far I run, the shadows of those rules will follow me forever, refusing to fade away. Sometimes, the things that should fade away, the things that should just be written off as a trick of the mind, stick around instead, lodged in the back of your head like a splinter you can't pull out. It's been years since that night, but I still find myself thinking about it, sometimes when I least expect it, and it makes me shiver every single time. It happened in the woods, back in Louisiana, the kind of place that has its own heartbeat, where the shadows seem to stretch just a little too far, and the air is heavy with secrets. It was summer, a stifling Louisiana summer where the air wraps around you like a wet blanket, and it feels like even the trees are sweating. I was about 19 at the time, just out of high school, and I had this tight-knit group of friends, Alex, Jay, and Mia. We'd grown up together, spent countless weekends exploring the woods behind my parents' place, the kind of thick, tangled forest that seems endless when you're a kid. By the time we were teenagers, we knew every nook and cranny of those woods, or at least we thought we did. There was one spot we liked to go, a clearing about a mile in, surrounded by tall cypress trees with this big, gnarled stump right in the middle. We called it the throne because, well, it looked like something out of a fairy tale, the kind of place where a forest king might sit and hold court. It was our place, a spot we'd go to escape, to laugh, to share stories, to just be ourselves. One night, we decided to head out there after dark. It wasn't the first time, but it was one of those nights where the air felt thick with something, like the whole world was holding its breath. There was a full moon, and it cast this silvery light through the branches, but the shadows seemed darker, almost like they were pushing back against the light. We were laughing, joking around as we made our way down the path, our flashlights flicking over the underbrush, catching the glow of a few pairs of startled eyes, raccoons maybe, or deer. Normal enough. We made it to the throne, and Jay, being Jay, immediately climbed up onto the stump, striking some ridiculous pose like he was the king of the woods. Mia and I were laughing, and Alex was off to the side, fiddling with his phone, trying to get a signal. It was one of those moments where everything just felt right, you know? Like we were invincible, like nothing in the world could touch us. And then I saw it, a shadow, just at the edge of the clearing, moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was Alex. He was the only one who'd wandered off. But then, I heard Alex curse from the opposite direction, frustrated with his phone. I looked back toward the shadow, squinting, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. But there was nothing there, just the trees, the underbrush, the same old woods we'd known all our lives. But something felt off. I felt this chill, this crawling sensation at the back of my neck like I was being watched, like there were eyes in the dark, staring at me. I didn't say anything, not then. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who freaks out over nothing, especially not in front of my friends. So I shook it off, laughed it off, and we kept going, telling stories, daring each other to climb the tallest trees, just being dumb kids. It wasn't until later, when we started heading back, that things got strange. We were walking in a line, Alex in front, then Mia, then me, and Jay bringing up the rear. I kept hearing these sounds. Footsteps, but not in sync with ours, almost like they were just a second behind. I kept glancing back, but every time I did, there was nothing there, just the dark path stretching back into the woods. I told myself it was an echo, or maybe an animal, something harmless. We were about halfway back to my place when Mia suddenly stopped, her flashlight jerking to the side, her breath catching in her throat. I almost ran into her, and Alex turned around, annoyed, about to ask why she'd stopped. But then I saw her face, pale, her eyes wide, staring at something over my shoulder. "What?" I asked, my voice coming out more like a whisper than I meant it to. "What is it?" Mia didn't say anything for a moment, and then she just shook her head, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the words. Finally she managed, I thought I saw someone, behind you." A chill ran down my spine and I turned, my flashlight sweeping over the trees, but there was nothing. Just shadows, branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease that was starting to settle in my chest. "Probably just Jay messing around," I said, but when I looked back at Jay, he was standing right there, his face just as pale as Mia's. We kept moving, but the atmosphere had changed. The woods, which had always felt like a second home, suddenly felt different, like we were trespassing, like we weren't welcome anymore. The air was colder, and every little sound seemed magnified, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches, the distant call of some night bird. It felt like the forest was alive, watching us, waiting for something. We finally made it back to my parents' house, and we all went inside, collapsing in the living room, the tension easing slightly now that there were walls around us. My mom asked if we wanted something to eat, and we all just nodded, trying to act normal, trying to pretend like nothing had happened. But Mia was still quiet, her eyes darting to the windows every few seconds, like she expected to see something looking back at her. It wasn't until later, after my parents had gone to bed and we were all piled up in the living room, Jay on the couch, Mia and Alex on the floor, and me in the armchair, that Mia spoke up again. Her voice was barely a whisper, and we all had to lean in to hear her. "I saw it," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I saw it behind you, standing right there, just watching." "What did it look like?" Alex asked, his voice tight. Mia shook her head, her brow furrowing. I don't know, it was dark, like a shadow, but solid. And tall. Taller than you, maybe even taller than Jay. It was just standing there, like it was waiting. A shiver ran through me, and I glanced toward the window, the curtains drawn tight, the night pressing against the glass. I wanted to say something, to tell her she was just imagining things, that it was a trick of the light, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew she wasn't lying. I'd felt it too, that presence, that cold, watching us from the shadows. We didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise made us jump. The creak of the house settling, the wind rustling the branches outside, the distant howl of some animal. At some point, Jay turned on the TV, and we all pretended to watch, but I don't think any of us were really paying attention. We were too busy listening, waiting for something we couldn't quite name. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the oppressive feeling of the night before had lifted, like it had never been there at all. We tried to laugh it off, to chalk it up to our imaginations, to the darkness playing tricks on us. But none of us wanted to go back into the woods, not for a long time. It was a few weeks later when I was hanging out with Alex that he brought it up again. We were sitting in his garage, listening to music, just passing the time, when he suddenly turned to me, his expression serious. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, all the time." Alex was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I didn't want to say anything in front of the others, but I saw it too, just for a second right before Mia freaked out. It was there, behind you, and it moved like it was reaching for you." A chill ran through me, and I felt the hair on my arms stand up. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Alex shook his head. "I don't know. I didn't want to scare anyone more than they already were, but I swear, it was real. I wasn't imagining it." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to deny it, to brush it off as just a shared delusion, something our minds had conjured up in the dark. But another part of me knew better. I could still feel that cold, that sense of being watched. And it was something I couldn't explain away. We never did figure out what we saw that night. We stayed out of the woods after dark, and eventually, we all went our separate ways. College, jobs, life pulling us in different directions. But there's never anything there, just empty air, just shadows that seem a little too deep. It's strange how something like that can leave a mark on you, even after all these years. I mean, it wasn't like we saw a ghost or anything concrete, just a shadow, just a feeling. But it was enough to stick with me, to make me question what's real and what isn't, especially when it gets dark. I remember one night, maybe a year or so later, I was back home for the summer after my first year of college. My parents had gone out for the evening, and I was alone in the house, just watching TV, trying to ignore the way the woods outside seemed to press against the windows, the way the darkness seemed thicker here than anywhere else. It was late, maybe midnight, when I heard it, a tap at the window. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand, my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch, just the wind, but deep down I knew better. The tap came again, this soft, deliberate sound like someone, or something, was letting me know it was there. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body told me not to look, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly I turned my head, my eyes flicking toward the window. There was nothing there. Just darkness, just my reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and pale. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, trying to laugh it off, trying to shake off the tension that had settled in my chest. But as I reached down to pick up the remote, I caught something, just a flicker of movement, just a hint of something shifting in the shadows behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but the room was empty. The door to the hallway was open, the darkness beyond it yawning and endless, and for a moment I thought I saw something. Just a shape, just a shadow slipping away, disappearing around the corner. I stood up, my legs shaky, my hands clammy, and I moved to the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling, barely louder than a whisper. There was no answer, just the silence of the house, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards settling. I took a step into the hallway, my eyes straining to see into the dark, but there was nothing there. I flicked on the light, the sudden brightness almost blinding, and I let out a shaky breath. The house was empty. I knew that. But I couldn't shake the feeling. That same feeling I'd had in the woods, that same cold, creeping sense that I was not alone, that there was something there, just out of sight, just waiting. I spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, the TV blaring, trying to drown out the silence, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. And maybe it was. Maybe it still is. But even now, all these years later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed us out of those woods that night. That something saw us, marked us, and never quite let go. Sometimes I wonder if my friends still think about it. We don't talk much anymore. Life gets in the way, you know how it is. But every now and then I'll get a message from one of them. Just a simple, "Hey, remember that night?" And I'll know exactly what they're talking about. I'll know they still feel it too. That same lingering fear. That same sense of something unfinished. And sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear it. The soft rustle of leaves, the faint tap at the window, the echo of footsteps just a beat behind mine. And I wonder if one day I'll turn around and it'll be there, waiting, just like it always was. I've got a cabin up in Idaho, nestled in the kind of woods where the pine trees grow thick, and the world feels a million miles away. It's a place I used to go to clear my head. No neighbors, no noise, just me, the birds, and the wind. It's peaceful there, or at least it used to be. I hadn't been back in 5 years until recently, and to be honest, there's a reason for that. It's hard to explain why I stayed away so long, but after what happened, I just couldn't bring myself to return. It all started one winter weekend. I decided to take a break from work, from life, and spend some time up at the cabin. I figured I'd chop some wood, make a fire, maybe even get a little writing done. Just me and nature. It had been a few months since my last visit, but the place always felt like home. As I drove up the winding dirt road, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in, thick branches forming a canopy over the path. By the time I pulled up, it was late afternoon, and the sun was just starting to dip behind the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. As I got out of the car, I noticed the wind had picked up, rustling through the treetops, creating a constant shushing sound that filled the air. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way to the front door, already imagining the warmth of the fireplace and a cup of hot coffee. But something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, just this nagging sense that something wasn't right. That's when I saw it, a broken window on the side of the cabin. It wasn't shattered entirely, just a single pane of glass, cracked and splintered, like maybe a branch had blown against it. The hole was big enough that someone could have reached through and undone the latch. My stomach twisted for a moment, but I brushed it off. It's a remote cabin, I told myself. These things happen. The wind, a stray rock, maybe even a bird. It could have been anything. I made a mental note to fix it later and went inside. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it. A couple of old blankets thrown over the worn-out couch, a stack of firewood by the hearth, and that familiar musty smell that comes from a place being locked up for too long. I checked the main rooms, looking for any sign of an intruder, but there was nothing. No mess, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been inside. Everything was in its place. Still, there was this feeling in the back of my mind, something like unease, but I tried to shake it off. I started a fire in the wood stove, watching the flames catch and flicker, the orange glow spreading across the walls. The cabin slowly warmed, the chill receding as the fire crackled and popped. I made myself a simple dinner, sitting at the small kitchen table, the wind still howling outside. The only other sound was the occasional snap of a log in the fire. It was calm, quiet, everything I'd wanted. After dinner, I stretched out on the couch, the firelight flickering against the darkened windows, shadows dancing on the walls. I could hear the wind pushing against the cabin, the way it seemed to sneak in through the cracks around the doorframe. I must have dozed off at some point, the warmth of the fire lulling me to sleep. When I woke, it was pitch black outside, and the fire had died down to embers, barely giving off any light. I glanced at my watch, 1:24 a.m. That's when I felt it, that unmistakable sense of fear. It wasn't a sound or something I saw, but a feeling, deep and visceral, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I sat up, listening, my heart pounding in the darkness. The wind had stopped, and the silence was oppressive, heavy. Something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the couch and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. The room looked the same as before, nothing out of place, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I got up, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and slowly made my way to the hallway, the beam of the flashlight shaking slightly as my hand trembled. Then I saw it, a trail of muddy footprints. They led from the broken window across the floor and stopped right in front of the couch where I'd been sleeping. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a chill rush down my spine. The footprints were wet, dark, and unmistakably human. They'd come from outside, through the broken window, and ended at the spot where I'd just been lying. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I was frozen, my eyes tracing the path of the footprints again and again, trying to understand. Slowly, I followed the trail backward, the beam of my flashlight revealing each step in the dust. They led from the window to the couch, and then to my bed. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as I turned towards the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for the darkness inside to seem endless. I stepped closer, each movement feeling heavy, like I was wading through water. I could hear my own breathing, shallow, fast, echoing in the silence. When I reached the doorway, I shone the flashlight into the room. Everything seemed normal at first. The bed neatly made, the closet door shut, nothing out of place. I took a step inside, the floorboards creaking beneath me. Then I looked down at the space beneath the bed. A hand, pale, dirty, reaching out from under the bed. I stumbled backward, the flashlight dropping from my hands, the light spinning wildly across the room before going out completely. I heard myself scream, the sound echoing off the walls, and I turned and ran. I didn't stop to grab anything. I just bolted for the door, my bare feet sliding on the wooden floor as I reached for the handle and yanked it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I ran out into the dark, the icy wind biting at my skin, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The trees loomed around me, their branches reaching down like hands, and I ran, stumbling over rocks and roots, not daring to look back at the cabin. I could feel something behind me, that same heavy presence, like eyes boring into my back, but I didn't turn around. I just kept running. I don't know how long I ran before I reached my car, parked at the end of the narrow path. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once, twice, before finally getting the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the doors, my eyes fixed on the dark trail leading back to the cabin, half expecting to see someone, something, standing there, watching me. But there was nothing. Just darkness and the wind and the sound of my own panicked breathing. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and I peeled out of there, the tires skidding on the gravel. I didn't look back, not once. I drove straight to the nearest town, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my mind racing. I found the police station, the lights on, a single officer sitting at the desk inside. I stumbled in, my words coming out in a frantic rush as I tried to explain what had happened. The officer listened, his face serious, but there was something in his eyes, something that told me he'd heard stories like this before. He called for backup, a couple more officers heading out towards the cabin while he took my statement. I stayed there, wrapped in a blanket they'd given me, the warmth doing nothing to chase away the cold that had settled in my bones. They didn't find anyone. When they got to the cabin, the place was empty. No footprints, no broken window, nothing. Just the bed, neatly made, the room exactly as I'd left it. It was like it had all been a dream, like I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd felt. The officer gave me a sympathetic look, told me it was probably just my imagination, maybe a trick of the light, but I could see he didn't believe it either. I never went back to that cabin. Not for 5 years. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Every time I thought about it, I'd see that hand, pale and dirty, reaching out from under the bed, and I'd feel that same cold fear, that same sense of something just beyond the edge of understanding, something that didn't belong. 5 years later, I finally got the courage to go back. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted closure, Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The cabin was still there, untouched, the woods just as thick and dark as I remembered. The window was still broken, the glass cracked, the same hole in the pane. I stepped inside, the air stale, the familiar musty smell of the cabin wrapping around me like an unwelcome embrace. Dust covered everything, the couch, the shelves, the wood stove. It was like time had stopped the moment I left. My footsteps echoed through the empty room, each creak of the floorboards making my heart jump just a little. The firewood was still stacked neatly next to the fireplace, the blankets draped over the old couch. Everything was exactly as I had left it, and yet there was a different kind of silence now, one that pressed against my ears, thick and heavy. It was almost as if the cabin was holding its breath, waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had come here for a reason. I wanted to prove that I wasn't afraid anymore, that whatever had happened that night didn't control me. I walked over to the kitchen table, setting down the bag I'd brought with me, a few supplies, nothing much. I figured I'd stay the night, just to face whatever fears were buried here. The first thing I did was check the window, the one that had been broken all those years ago. It was still cracked, the edges of the pane jagged. I ran my fingers along the glass, careful not to cut myself, and for a moment I felt a shiver run down my spine. I pulled my hand back, turning away, trying to shake off the unease. I decided to make myself useful, trying to get some kind of routine going. I swept the floor, cleaned off the dust from the surfaces, even opened a couple of windows to let in some fresh air. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the light streaming in through the trees, I forced myself to relax. I told myself that tonight would be different. I'd stay, I'd sleep, and I'd wake up in the morning without anything to fear. But as night fell, the old familiar sense of dread crept back in. I couldn't help it. Every little noise seemed magnified. The wind outside, the rustle of the branches, it all felt too loud, too close. I lit a few candles, placing them around the room, their soft glow making the shadows flicker across the walls. It was around midnight when I decided to try and sleep. The fire had been lit for a while, casting a warm glow, and I settled down on the couch, wrapping one of the old blankets around myself. The room was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the fire and the wind outside. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to relax, to let go of the memories that kept surfacing, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I don't know how long I dozed, but I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The candles had all burned out, and the cabin was plunged into a deep, unsettling darkness. I squinted at my watch, 1:24 a.m., the exact same time as before. A chill ran down my spine, and I slowly sat up, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The air was cold, colder than it had been all night, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. Something wasn't right. I could feel it, that same deep, gnawing sense of dread that had woken me up 5 years ago. I reached for the flashlight I'd brought with me, my fingers trembling as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the cabin's interior, empty, silent. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky, and took a step towards the hallway. The door to the bedroom was closed, just like before. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as I walked towards it, the flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. I reached the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. Every part of me was screaming to leave, to get out of the cabin and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I turned the handle, the door creaking open, the sound loud in the stillness. The beam of the flashlight swept across the room, and everything seemed normal. The bed, the closet door, the empty corners. I took a step inside, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Wet, muddy footprints. They started at the window, just like before, leading across the floor towards the bed. My heart dropped into my stomach as I stared at them, my hands shaking. It was impossible. There was no way anyone could have gotten in, no way anyone could have found me. But the footprints were there, dark and wet, glistening in the dim light. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw something, movement, just out of the corner of my eye. I turned, the beam swinging wildly, and that's when I heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost inaudible, coming from beneath the bed. I swallowed, my throat dry, my entire body trembling. I knelt down, slowly lowering the flashlight, the beam inching closer and closer to the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned in, peering beneath the bed. There in the darkness was a face, pale, dirty, with wide, staring eyes. I gasped, stumbling back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor, the beam swinging wildly. I saw the hand, dirty, thin, reaching out from under the bed, the fingers grasping at the floorboards as if trying to pull itself out. I turned and ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I just ran, my feet slipping on the wooden floor, my breath coming in frantic gasps. I burst out of the cabin, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. The trees loomed around me, their branches swaying in the wind, and I ran, my feet crunching over the frosted ground, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I could barely get them into the lock, my entire body trembling, every nerve screaming at me to get away. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut, locking it, my eyes fixed on the dark trail leading back to the cabin. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the doorway of the cabin. Just standing there, watching me. It was too dark to see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me, feel the weight of their stare. My breath caught in my throat, and I started the car, the engine roaring to life. I didn't wait. I put it in gear and floored it, the tires spinning for a second before catching, the car lurching forward. I drove, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, but the figure was gone. The cabin disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the trees, and I kept driving, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. I didn't stop until I reached the small town miles away, the lights of the gas station glowing like a beacon in the night. I pulled in, my entire body trembling as I put the car in park, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked at myself in the mirror, my face pale, my eyes wide with fear. I knew, deep down, that I would never go back to that cabin. Not ever. Whatever was there, whatever had been waiting for me, it wasn't something I could understand, wasn't something I could fight. It was something dark, something that didn't belong in this world. And the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night, even now, all these years later, it knew me, it had waited for me, and I'm terrified that someday, somehow, it might find me again. You know, I've never quite shaken off that one night back in 1989. It was the kind of night that sticks with you, replaying over and over in the back of your mind, the edges blurry, but the core of it all, still chilling. I was about 18, maybe 19 at the time, and it was late fall, a time when the air started to carry that sharp bite, and the night seemed longer, heavier. It was a weekend night, I think it must have been a Friday, when my best friend hung, and I decided to head out and take a walk. We lived in a small neighborhood on the edge of town. You know the kind, where the streets are barely lit, and there's just enough space between houses for the darkness to really take hold. There wasn't much to do, really, in our town. I guess boredom is what got us out there that night, walking down those narrow streets without any real plan. The world around us was still, just that kind of unsettling silence that made every crunch of a dry leaf underfoot seem almost too loud. Hung and I talked quietly, our voices low, almost like we didn't want to disturb something that lay just out of sight. The night felt different somehow, heavier, like we were walking through something that didn't belong to us. We were headed to this old intersection about a half-mile from Hung's house. This intersection wasn't anything special, just a simple crossroad with a small streetlight that flickered more than it shone. But that night, it felt like the center of something strange, like we were supposed to be there, drawn to it for reasons we couldn't explain. I remember we stood there, Hung and I, just kicking at the gravel, looking around like we were waiting for something to happen. And it did. It started with a noise, faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. A rustle, maybe, like the wind moving through the branches, except the air was perfectly still. I glanced at Hung, and he gave me this look, his brow furrowed like he'd heard it too. We both turned towards the dark stretch of road that led off to the left, the one that disappeared between rows of tall trees. And that's when I saw them. They were silhouettes at first, just shapes moving in the dark, and I remember squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were 4 of them, tall, impossibly tall, like shadows of giants moving slowly, steadily towards us. My first thought was that they were on horseback. The way they moved was so smooth, so unnatural, and they were bigger than anything should have been, taller than the trees, with these long, flowing cloaks that seemed to swallow the light around them. Hung grabbed my arm, and I could feel his fingers digging in, but I couldn't look away. It was like I was stuck, rooted to the ground, unable to do anything but watch as they came closer, their forms becoming clearer. They wore dark cloaks, the fabric heavy and rippling as they moved, but their faces, there were no faces. Just darkness under the hoods, emptiness that seemed to stare right through you. And then they stopped. Not 20 feet away from us, they just stopped. And I swear the air went cold. So cold that my breath came out in clouds, even though it wasn't that kind of night. I could feel my heart pounding, this overwhelming sense of dread washing over me, like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. I was frozen, staring up at these towering figures that seemed to be looking down at us without eyes. One of them raised an arm, a slow, deliberate movement, and pointed right at us. And that was when whatever hold had kept me there shattered. Hung yelled, this guttural, terrified sound, and yanked me back, and suddenly we were running. I don't even remember turning, just that we were moving, sprinting down the street, the gravel crunching under our feet, our breaths ragged and loud in the stillness of the night. We didn't look back. We couldn't. I think both of us were too afraid of what we'd see if we did. Those tall, faceless riders, somehow even closer, reaching out for us. We ran all the way back to Hung's house, slammed the door shut behind us, and collapsed in the hallway, gasping for breath. Hung's mom came out of the kitchen, her face a mix of confusion and concern, but neither of us could explain what had just happened. What could we have said? That we'd seen 4 towering figures riding through the night, pointing at us like they'd come to take us away? We didn't sleep that night. We stayed in Hung's room, the door locked, the light on, and we just sat there, listening. Every little noise outside, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made us jump. We kept expecting to hear footsteps, the clop of hooves on the pavement, something to tell us they'd followed us back. But the night passed, slowly, and nothing happened. The next morning, we went back to the intersection. I don't know why. Maybe we thought we'd imagined it all, that in the light of day it would seem less real. But when we got there, everything looked the same. The streetlight was still flickering, the road was empty, and there was no sign of anything unusual. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to prove that what we'd seen had actually happened. But Hung and I knew. We didn't talk about it much after that, just exchanged these uneasy glances whenever we walked past that intersection. And neither of us ever went back there at night. It was like an unspoken rule. We just avoided it, like some part of us knew that whatever we'd seen was still out there, waiting. Sometimes, even now, I'll catch myself thinking about that night. I'll be lying in bed, the house dark and quiet, and I'll remember the way those figures moved, the emptiness under their hoods, and that cold that sank into my bones. And I wonder, what were they? Why were they there? Were they waiting for something, or someone? Or maybe they were a warning, a glimpse of something we weren't supposed to see. I don't have any answers, and maybe I never will. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever we saw that night, it was real. And it's still out there somewhere, waiting in the dark, just beyond the edge of the light. It all started when I was still in high school, living with my parents and my younger brother in a quiet suburban house in the Midwest. I grew up in one of those neighborhoods where everyone knew each other. It felt safe, almost idyllic. Our town was the kind of place where people waved as they drove by, where you knew the name of your mailman, and where any face you didn't recognize was still met with a friendly smile. You wouldn't think of locking your doors during the day. In a way, it was almost boring. No drama, no surprises. Everything was just predictable, until it wasn't. I'm not really sure how to explain what happened. I guess the best place to start is with the cigarettes. I had a roommate at the time, not back at my parents' house, but later on after I had moved out. Her name was Clara. Clara was kind of quirky. She liked her space, kept mostly to herself, and we didn't have a lot of deep conversations. I didn't know her extremely well, but she seemed like a good enough roommate. We split the bills and kept things tidy, and that was good enough for me. One day, Clara asked me for a cigarette. She looked tense, like something had gotten under her skin, and I remember her standing there in the doorway of the kitchen, almost wringing her hands. I laughed and said, "Clara, I don't smoke." She gave me this strange look, almost as if she didn't believe me, and then she said, "Oh well, I thought maybe they were yours? Maybe they're Jonah's?" Jonah was our other roommate, a quiet guy, worked late shifts, so we hardly ever saw him. But this time, I was confused. "Jonah doesn't smoke either," I said. Clara just looked at me for a moment and then shrugged, but I could see something flicker across her face, something uneasy. "I keep finding cigarette butts outside," she said, "near the side door and the front steps. I just assumed one of you was smoking." I shook my head. "Nope, not us." We both let it drop after that, but I remember how uneasy it made me feel. We'd been living there for a few months by then, and it had never occurred to me to wonder who might be hanging around our house, smoking cigarettes. It was just one of those things that didn't fit, and I didn't like things that didn't fit. Clara mentioned it again a week later. This time, she seemed more agitated, a little shaken even. She had come home from work, late. She left before either Jonah or I got up, and she got back around 8 in the evening. I was on the couch, half asleep, when she came in, her footsteps heavy and fast. "Did you hear anything last night?" she asked. She didn't sit down, just stood in the doorway with her bag hanging off one shoulder. I blinked, trying to shake off the sleep. "Like what?" I asked. "Like someone talking, outside." She paused, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to continue. "I thought I heard voices, but when I looked out the window, I didn't see anyone. And there were more cigarette butts on the steps this morning." I frowned, sitting up. I hadn't heard anything. Our neighborhood was quiet, especially at night. The only sounds were the occasional distant bark of a dog or the rustling of leaves in the wind. I shook my head. "No, I didn't hear anything." "Are you sure it wasn't just someone walking by?" Clara hesitated and then nodded, but she didn't look convinced. "Maybe," she said, but I could see the unease in her eyes. Something had rattled her, and I didn't know what to say to make it better. We left it at that, but I couldn't help feeling like something wasn't right. Then things started getting weird. Jonah and I both worked odd hours. He worked late nights, and I had classes during the day and shifts at a local cafe in the evenings. Our schedules rarely lined up, and Clara, with her early mornings, was like a ghost in the house. We were 3 people living together, but we hardly ever saw each other, which is probably why it took so long for us to realize what was happening. One night, I was lying in bed, drifting off, when I heard it. A soft sound, almost like a knock. It wasn't coming from the door. It was from the back of the house, from the direction of the window that looked out over the yard and the fence. I held my breath, straining to hear, and then I heard it again. This time, it was a low voice, too faint to make out the words. My heart started to pound, and I sat up, staring at the window. The curtains were closed, but there was enough light from the street to see the outline of the window, the faint shadows from the branches outside swaying in the wind. I waited, listening, but after a moment, the sound stopped. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, Clara looked tired. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were shaking slightly as she poured herself a cup of coffee. I asked her if she was okay, and she just shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I heard it again," she said. "Voices. Someone was out there." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Did you see anyone?" I asked. Clara shook her head, her eyes fixed on her cup. "No, but I know I heard them, and I saw a man by the fence last week. I didn't say anything because I thought maybe it was nothing, but I don't know." A man by the fence. The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. I tried to brush it off, tried to reassure her that it was probably just someone passing through, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. I started to wonder, was someone watching us? Things only got worse after that. The cigarette butts kept showing up, sometimes just one, sometimes a whole pile, like someone had been standing there for hours. Clara started keeping her curtains drawn all the time, and she jumped at every little noise. I started to feel it too, that sense of being watched, that cold, creeping feeling that someone was out there just beyond the edges of the light. And then, one night, everything changed. It was late, probably around midnight. I was in the living room, flipping through channels, trying to find something to watch. The house was quiet. Clara was already in bed, and Jonah was at work. The only light was the flicker of the TV, and the only sound was the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen. And then I heard it. The back door, the one that led out to the yard, creaking open. My heart stopped. I muted the TV, straining to listen. There was a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps on the linoleum, and then the door clicked shut. I sat there, frozen, my eyes wide, my heart pounding in my ears. Someone was in the house. Slowly I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling. I dialed Jonah's number, hoping he was on a break, hoping he would pick up. The phone rang once, twice, and then I heard a voice, not Jonah's, but a low, whispering voice coming from the hallway. "Hello," it said, and my blood ran cold. I stood up, my legs shaky, and slowly turned toward the hallway. The light from the TV cast long shadows, and in the darkness I could just make out a figure, tall, standing there, barely more than a silhouette. It was facing me, its head tilted slightly to the side, and I could see the faint glow of a cigarette, the tip flaring red as the figure took a drag. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My phone slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud, and the figure turned, slowly, and started walking toward the back door. It moved so calmly, so deliberately, and I could hear the soft click of the door as it opened, the creak as it closed behind it. I stood there for what felt like forever, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Finally I moved, my legs feeling like jelly, and I ran to the back door, locking it, double-checking all the windows, making sure every door was locked, every curtain drawn. The next morning, Clara was gone. She left a note on the kitchen table saying she couldn't stay there anymore, that she was moving out, that she was sorry. Jonah and I never saw her again. I wish I could say I found out who it was, that we called the cops, that they caught someone, that it all made sense in the end. But none of that happened. Jonah and I stayed for a few more months, and then we both moved out, went our separate ways. I never heard those voices again, never saw that figure. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about it. About the cigarette butts, the voices in the dark, the figure standing in the hallway, just watching, and I wonder, who was he? And what did he want? And most of all, how long had he been there, watching us, before we even noticed? I waited. The seconds felt like hours, every tiny sound magnified, the ticking of the clock on the wall echoing in the silence. My phone buzzed again, a message from my husband. "Almost there. Stay where you are." I could hear the distant wail of sirens growing louder, closer. Relief washed over me, my knees almost buckling as I let out a shaky breath. They were coming. It was almost over. But then there was another sound, one that sent a chill down my spine. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. The sound of a window sliding open. My eyes widened, my heart pounding as I turned towards the hallway, the spare bedroom. I could see the window from where I stood, the dark shape of it just visible, and I watched in horror as a hand appeared, gripping the edge of the frame. He was coming in. I backed away, my feet moving before my mind could catch up, my body reacting purely on instinct. I ran to the door, pulling it open just as my husband burst into the hallway, his eyes wide with panic. Behind him, 2 police officers rushed in, their guns drawn. "He's in the window," I screamed, pointing towards the hallway. The officers ran past us, their footsteps heavy against the floor, and I heard them shouting, their voices loud and commanding. I held on to my husband, my entire body trembling as I listened, waiting. There was a crash, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, followed by more shouting, and then silence. Max barked, his tail wagging as he looked up at us, oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded. My husband held me close, his arms wrapped around me, his voice soft as he whispered that it was over, that I was safe. But as I stood there, my heart still racing, I knew that it wasn't over. Not really. They caught him that night. The man who had broken into our house, who had tried to break into our apartment. He was a stranger, someone I'd never seen before, someone with no connection to us. The police said he was probably a drifter, that we'd just been unlucky. But I didn't believe them. I knew he had been looking for me. I knew he had found me somehow. We moved again, this time to a different city. I couldn't stay there, couldn't keep living in a place that he knew, a place where he had almost reached me. My husband understood. He didn't argue. He just packed our things and we left, leaving behind another home, another set of memories tainted by fear. And now, even in our new place, with all the locks and alarms and cameras, I still don't feel safe. I still hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway, still see shadows moving beneath the door, and sometimes late at night, I still hear the knock. Soft, deliberate, like someone testing to see if I'm home. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and there was something in it that scared me, something I hadn't heard before. "What?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud, even though I was trying to keep it quiet. I stepped up beside him, squinting into the dark, trying to see what he was looking at. That's when I saw him. About 40 feet ahead of us, there was a man. He was just standing there, in the middle of the trail. The beam of Jason's flashlight caught him, part of his face, his shoulder, and something else. A shovel. He was holding a shovel. For a second, I thought maybe he was a ranger or something, but then I saw his eyes. They were wide, staring at us, unblinking. There was no reason for him to be there, no logical explanation that made any kind of sense. He was just standing there, staring, and the look on his face, like he was seeing us but not really seeing us, made my skin crawl. It was like he wasn't really there, like his mind was somewhere else, but his eyes were fixed right on us. Jason's hands shook, and the flashlight wobbled, making the shadows dance around the man, and I swear it looked like he smiled. Just for a second. Not a normal smile, but one that made my blood run cold, like he knew something we didn't. "Let's go," Jason whispered, his voice shaking. He didn't wait for me to answer. He turned and started walking back the way we came, faster than before, his footsteps crunching against the leaves. I followed, my heart pounding, my eyes darting back and forth between the trees. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the man behind us, but there was nothing, just darkness. We didn't talk, we just moved. Faster and faster, the flashlight swinging wildly, the shadows growing and shrinking with each step. The wind was picking up, the branches creaking above us, and I felt this overwhelming urge to run, like something was behind me, something I couldn't see but could feel, just out of sight. I wanted to tell Jason to hurry, but my throat was so tight, I could barely breathe. We finally reached the clearing where we'd left our bikes. I let out a breath, relief washing over me for a split second, until I looked up and saw the car. The car we had seen before, parked just beyond the trail entrance, was gone. It had been there when we went in, a dark sedan, the kind you'd barely notice, parked to the side like it was waiting for someone. We hadn't thought much of it, but now it was gone, and the absence of it felt wrong, like a missing piece of a puzzle, something that should have been there but wasn't. Jason cursed under his breath, and I could hear the panic creeping in, the edge to his voice as he fumbled to unlock his bike. I grabbed mine, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the lock off. The whole time, I felt like I needed to keep looking over my shoulder, like any second I'd see him. The man with the shovel, just standing there, those wide eyes staring at us, unblinking. We got on our bikes, and without a word we took off, pedaling as fast as we could. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and the wind whipped past my face, cold and sharp. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out, getting away from that place. We didn't stop until we were back at Jason's Jeep, parked near the main road. We threw our bikes into the back, our breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back at the forest, the dark line of trees silhouetted against the sky, and I felt it, that feeling like we had barely made it out, like something was still there, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Jason got in the driver's seat, and I climbed in beside him, slamming the door shut, locking it immediately. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there, the engine idling, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I could feel my heart pounding, my skin prickling with fear. Jason's hands were still shaking as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. "We shouldn't have come here," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, swallowing hard, my throat dry. He put the car in gear and we drove away, the forest disappearing behind us, swallowed by the dark. After that night, we never talked about it again. Not really. Sure, we mentioned it a few times, in that kind of offhand way you talk about something that scares you, but only to make sure it still felt real. Jason and I, we used to be the kind of guys who weren't afraid of anything. But that night changed something. It wasn't just the man we saw or the fear we felt. It was the realization that there are things out there, things you can't explain, things that make the world feel so much bigger and so much more dangerous than you ever thought possible. We heard stories later, rumors, about people going missing in that forest, about strange things seen late at night, figures standing on the trails, strange lights, voices calling from the trees. I don't know if any of it is true. All I know is what we saw, what we felt, and the way the air seemed to change, like we weren't supposed to be there, like we had stepped into a place that didn't belong to us. Sometimes I still think about that man, his eyes, the way he just stood there, holding that shovel like it was the most natural thing in the world. I wonder what he was doing, what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. And I wonder about the car, why it was there, why it was gone when we got back. It's the not knowing that gets to me, the questions that have no answers, the pieces of the story that don't fit. Jason and I, we never went back to that forest. We stayed away, and even now, years later, I can't bring myself to drive past it. There's something about it, something that feels wrong, like a shadow that never goes.